I was last living in Alberta 7 years ago, and oil prices then were rather higher than now, and I have to say we had rather more representation in the Western Conference playoffs. Not sure what everybody's been doing for the last 7 years, but it's good to be back, and certainly good to be part of the CCEMC process. I really salute those 25 companies and their really brilliant ideas. May they all come through. Timing. Timing is everything in sport, investment, in politics. What is going to happen? When will it happen? Well, if we think about the future, I think the future is tense. Future tense. I think it's going to be a really difficult race against time to combat climate change, and we've heard much about that already today. Tense resource allocation to ensure 8 billion people have the food and water they need, and tense political trade-offs to change our patterns of behaviour. So let me share my key assumptions. I believe sustainable development is a practical goal, and we can give everybody on this planet a good quality of life. I believe that our behaviour can be modified, even transformed by policy, be that subsidies, taxes, regulation, whatever. I believe we have some moral responsibility, as opposed to just self-interest, to protect the interests of future generations, from whom we've just heard. And I believe there is sufficient evidence that stress on our planet is reaching worrying levels. Without change, there will be alarming consequences. I spend quite a lot of my life traveling around the world with humanitarian causes, and I have no doubt that climate change is very real. Now, those are my assumptions. I don't know whether you share them. Anybody be prepared to share with me in all four? Maybe one or two? Well, let me move on and see if I can persuade you. So I live near London. That's London, UK. It may, of course, become London, England later this year, depending on what Scotland votes. But let me remind us of two examples where environmental issues were effectively addressed. So the first one is 1900, and this is a picture of a few of the 300,000 horses that were used to provide mobility for London. Cabs, buses, vans, whatever. Can you imagine the stench and the smell of 300,000 horses? Well, by 1915, it had all changed. The horse buses and the horse trams had all disappeared, and the motor engine had taken over. Second example, the fogs in London. Smoke from millions of chimneys polluting the air. They were called pea supers, and they caused a lot of deaths, especially in the Great Smog of 1952, when 4,000 people died. And yes, I remember that. Well, that led to the Clean Air Act, which banned the use of coal for domestic fires. And you know what? Ever since, London has been free of these fogs as people have warmed themselves with gas and electrical fires. In both cases, job done. There was a solution and there was an incentive. There was pain, there was pressure, and there was a cure. Ah, well, you say, but London is a single jurisdiction. The world is really not like that. Well, do you remember 1985 when we discovered the ozone holes in the Antarctic? Only 2 years after that, the Montreal Protocol between 43 countries brought in tight control of CFCs. So even in multiple jurisdictions, with most people unaffected, the job can be done. Where there's a will, there's a way. So here's my roadmap. I'd like to talk about what's new and what's not new, over the last 7 years. I'd like to share a little bit about Shell's scenarios, which I think provide helpful insights to the future, and what we need to grasp from them. I'd like to talk about from NIMBY to WIMBY. Well, you know what NIMBY stands for. I'll tell you what WIMBY stands for in a few minutes. What are the drivers of change, and who is going to lead them? So what's new since I was last here? Well, one thing that's new is clarity from the IPCC, and we heard from them this morning. Now, their message about climate change now is unequivocal. It didn't used to be so. The words they use, severe, pervasive, irreversible, overwhelming evidence, nobody on the planet is going to be untouched by the impacts of climate change, etc., etc., etc. I'm not sure about you, but I find it very hard to ignore the clarity of their conclusions. But what's not new is the public reaction. Now, I think most people accept the reality of climate change, and most people accept that mankind has had some responsibility, if not prime responsibility, for the causes. Not, I think, because of the IPCC and the scientific data, but more because of what they see and feel and hear about in weather patterns. Now, I know you've had a brutal winter in Canada. And to make matters worse, in Europe we've had the wettest, warmest winter ever. And that's what's happening. Colder, hotter, drier, wetter, violent shifts in the jet streams, polar warming, loss of glaciers, acidification of the oceans, and so on. I've seen it all over the world. Glaciers gone. Lands once damp and fertile, now dried out. But let's be honest, not many of us feel this as a priority. We like the lifestyles we have, or aspire to have. It's what I call the Exxon response. Did you read their release a couple of weeks ago? Exxon does not dispute that global warming is happening. But in the meantime, it's business as usual. And that's the way most people feel. It is business as usual. We're happy to leave it to our corporate and political leaders. And as consumers and citizens, we accept there is a cost, but we don't want to pay very much. And of course, the lack of action, and in some cases the lack of interest in the developing world, provides an easy excuse. Well, Casilla and CCEMC are also new, and I admire them both. Casilla, we well know, grew out of Osley in 2012, and now represents 13 of the biggest oil sands producers, and it focuses on accelerating environmental performance in key areas: tailings, water, land, and greenhouse gases. An excellent initiative, which I fully support, as I do the CCEMC. And that was created a few years ago as a key part of Alberta's climate change strategy. And for me, it's a real privilege to be part of this $35 million grand challenge. But what's not new is that we are still on incremental progress. Industry improvements in air and water and effluent and energy usage, etc., march on. Good that they do. They improve results, they improve reputation. It's the same with SDTC, which for many, many years has been the primary catalyst in building an SD technology infrastructure. It's all good work, but there aren't big breakthroughs. For me, over the last 7 years, we've learned that in BC, the carbon tax really works. Started in 2008, and since then, fuel consumption has fallen by, I think it's over 17% per capita. More than that relative to the rest of Canada. And I find that compelling. And given that the GDP of BC has kept pace with the rest of Canada over that time, it's clear that the tax didn't have any adverse effect on economic progress. What's not changed is that EU emissions trading doesn't work. At least I don't think it works. It's complex, it's indirect, and it's very blunt. Well, hopes were high, and I actually did the first trade on that exchange in 2005. And as we heard earlier from Jeremy Rifkin, Europe has targeted 27% of its energy from renewables by 2030. 27%, with Germany in the van. And last year, Germany spent billions and billions of euros subsidizing these marketplaces. They calculate it's somewhere between 150 and 200 euros per ton of CO2. Can you imagine? Well, that undermines completely the carbon market. The price of the ETS carbon credits as a result has been much lower than intended, with large surpluses of allowances. Today it's about €5, has been even lower. And in my view, and we've known that now for some time, these big cap and trade schemes really are not the way to go. Okay, so what's new in Formula One? The European version of NASCAR, perhaps? Well, I tell you what's new, it's the engines. Apart from the fact they now make very little noise, which is disappointing, the engine size is now 1600 cc, 1.6 litres. These are very small engines. They deliver 765 brake horsepower. Woo! Now, there's a bit of help from kinetic energy recovery systems and turbochargers, but the fact is they still do well over 200 miles per hour. Impressive. What's not new is the same sort of incremental development is happening right across the board. Energy efficiency in particular remains one of the best investments anybody can make. It saves money, saves energy, reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And the cumulative gain over time is extraordinary. We've heard about them already, but what's new is industrial strength solar. Now, these are very large solar farms which deliver potent energy supply. Now, there have been massive solar panel configurations in the Middle East for several years, but only last year one was brought in just 45 minutes from Las Vegas. 347,000 mirrors generate 377 megawatts at a remarkably competitive price. But on the other hand, and I have to take a different view to Jeremy earlier on, I don't think renewables are doing terribly well. Certainly in Europe, manufacturers of wind turbines and solar panels are in quite a lot of trouble. It's partly oversupply, and it's partly the shift from NIMBY to banana. I'm sure you all know that. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. And the problem with Europe, as opposed to the glorious open spaces of Canada, is that there are always people living nearby. So it's very, very hard to put in these investments. But it's also, in my view, a fact that the three legs of sustainable development, economic, social and environment, have to be in balance if a solution is to be sustainable. So if projects need big subsidies, like biomass, they're economically unsound. If they are ugly, like onshore wind farms, they're socially unsound. And if they are with really suspect green credentials, like corn ethanol, they're environmentally unsound. And they simply won't last. And I think if we had a little more honesty and a little less political posturing in Europe, we would have avoided wasting an enormous amount of taxpayers' money and instead promoted genuinely more sustainable solutions. We've already heard mention this morning about China's green program, and that certainly is new. They are the world's biggest polluter, but they're getting real on investment in environmental performance. I think there's been a step change in the senior leadership, and they're already now beginning to slow emissions. And it's good news too that they're collaborating with the USA in exchanging information on this. I take great heart from that. On the other hand, well, the lack of international accord is well understood. International discussions have rambled on with no prospect of a decisive agreement for years. Now, I know people will say, well, Kyoto in 1997 and Cancun in 2010 were big milestones. Well, yes, they were, but they haven't delivered against the promises. These conferences of the parties go on every year, and the next one will be in Peru this year, and I, for one, am not holding my breath for an outcome. Having been to a couple of them, I can tell you at times it feels somewhere between a Tower of Babel and a bench-clearing brawl. What's certainly new in the recent past is the extraordinary growth in US energy, particularly gas, as a result of fracking. And we see now the ability to tap massive reserves of hydrocarbons, which will not only make the US self-sustainable and, I think, very quickly become an exporter, but also is driving down the price of gas to levels which, I don't know, are going to have long-term and I think essentially positive implications for economic development. The difference now between gas prices in North America and Europe is simply extraordinary. And that's even before Putin got nasty with the Ukraine. Sadly, Keystone still languishes. Nothing really has changed. I think it's a vital piece of infrastructure, but I'm not sure it will ever get the final go-ahead. It's trapped between energy and the environment, between Canada and the USA, between business and politics, and between rhetoric and reality. And finally, what's new? Well, Neil Young was new for me. I'd never heard of him. You probably heard a lot about him. But when he turned up in Alberta in January, he got headlines all over the world. What hasn't changed is the reputation of the oil sands. Now, I don't think I really understand what Mr. Young was saying. But I do know that the issue of climate change and of greenhouse gas emissions and of hydrocarbon production in Alberta is long-running, emotional and complex. Oil sands is a tough business. I worked in it. Whether you're talking about reliability or results or reputation. Whether it's difficult to accept this or not, Alberta is in the crosswires from many quarters, and it's not helped by mixed messages from the rest of Canada. So if I step back, I can see good progress, but no breakthroughs. I can see that public attitudes are slow to change, and frankly, the threat of climate change has yet to register with the vast majority of people. We don't smell the horse or cough up the smog. And the rate of increase in greenhouse gas emissions hasn't changed either. Whatever Casilla or CCEMC or SDTC or industry is doing, their contribution has been dwarfed by the growth of CO2, particularly in the developing world. Rising populations, increasing standards of living, access to travel, and so on. And overall, let's face it, there has been a distinct lack of political or corporate leadership. And as we ease back into a more resilient world economic growth, we feel slightly more comfortable. Truth to tell, global warming is not our number one concern, and we are heating up nicely, just like the frogs. But today is about looking forward. And scenario planning, I think, is a powerful way of doing that. Shell produces these scenarios every couple of years, and if you haven't had a chance to look at them, I would encourage you to do that. You go on shell.com, they'll send you a copy, or you can download one. They're a good read. I think they're helpful because they enable you to navigate between the kinds of extreme events which we've recently seen in the world economy and passive complacency. You can steer a course between the false certainty of a single forecast and the confused paralysis that often strikes in troubled times. But note, the scenarios aren't forecasts. They're not intended to be that. They are internally consistent, robustly proofed alternative views of a future world. And the two scenarios that have most recently been produced are called mountains and oceans. Now, very interesting, Jeremy Rifkin talked about his two models, and those very closely resonate with what Shell was doing. I'm not sure who got there first. Mountains is a view from the top, as the name would suggest. It's a world in which influence concentrates amongst the already powerful, as advantage brings more advantage. Stability is the prize. Economic development is slowed by rigidities in structures. And the implications for energy? Well, those at the top align their interests to unlock resources only cautiously. Sluggish growth moderates supply and moderates demand. And a profound shift occurs in global infrastructure where natural gas becomes the backbone of the global energy system. And CCS, it takes off. Oceans, on the other hand, is a view from the horizon. This is the democratic world that Jeremy talked about, where power is devolved far and wide and compromise is king. Economic productivity surges on a wave of reforms, unleashing growth and expectations. Implications for energy? Market forces predominate. Supply-demand tightness and high prices unlock expensive resources and drives user efficiency. But liquid fuels and coal continue to dominate as gas undershoots global hopes until solar becomes the new backbone. So let me show you a couple of graphs from this. I don't ask you to look in too much detail at each of the bars, but they give you a sense of what two alternative futures might look like in terms of primary energy by source. So the first one is mountains. This is the controlling world. Note the remorseless increase. Note that hydrocarbons still dominate, primarily gas. And note that renewables is still slow to impact. And here's the view of oceans. The same remorseless increase in demand, the same hydrocarbons still the supply backbone, but note the impact of solar at the end. Let me just try and toggle between the two. There's mountains, there's oceans. The energy mix is different. In mountains, much stronger focus on gas, coal and oil giving way to solar. But the total energy demand is very similar. Hydrocarbons remain the core. So no reason to relax, Alberta. It's business as usual. Well, of course it isn't. And here's why. Here are the cumulative energy-related CO2 emissions associated with the two scenarios. And here's the 2 centigrade pathway. In either scenario, we go way over 2 degrees centigrade. Now, that is notwithstanding the capturing of ever-increasing energy efficiency. I mentioned this before, and the Formula One engines are but one example. Just look at the efficiencies we've already achieved between 1960 and 2010. A doubling of energy efficiency, and predicting at least doubling again by 2060. And all of that is already factored in to those greenhouse gas emissions rises. So this is what it looks like in the chart. This isn't IPCC science. This is just a group of smart people who connect with universities and companies all around the world to aggregate data and to make sure that the scenarios are internally consistent and robustly proofed. And in either scenario, the 2 degrees centigrade pathway looks to be unrealistic. In fact, it's already too late. So let me just compare those two scenarios. Total energy consumption is very similar. Give or take 80% energy consumption increase by 2050. But they're shaped very differently. In both scenarios, there is an extraordinary moderation of demand and an extraordinary acceleration of supply. There has to be both if the resources are available to meet the energy demands of the world. And in both scenarios, CO2 emissions continue to rise remorselessly. In other words, the 2 degrees centigrade is unrealistic, and the future is indeed tense. And remember, the same tension will apply to water and food just as much as it does to energy. We are focused on energy because we're in Alberta, because we're in Edmonton, because we're in the oil patch. The stress nexus is really a combination of the pressure on all the key natural resources, water, energy, and food. But if we stick with the energy factor particularly, what do I take away as critical success factors? Well, the first thing I take away is that clean and green have to go together. In other words, we will need cleaner fossil fuels with a CCS backbone and a revolution in renewable energy. And for sure, it's vital that natural gas displaces coal quickly. Secondly, that technology development is a sine qua non. And technology development has to translate to technology deployment. Innovation itself is exciting, but it's deployment that changes the game. And of course, for deployment, there has to be political and societal support. We have two wonderful technologies in nuclear and hydrogen, which could make a profound difference across the world today. But politically and socially, they don't have the support needed. Thirdly, we need innovative cross-boundary collaborations. We're all in this together. Great that the USA and China are working together. USA needs to work better with Europe, Europe with Canada, Canada with China, and so on. And of course, 2050 really is just around the corner. And if we're to make any sort of difference against those charts in the scenarios, then time is not on our side. There are no easy answers under either scenario. There are many opportunities, but the resource stresses are complex and urgent. In my view, and certainly that's what these scenarios say, mitigating the impact of climate change will become the global priority. It will become the global priority. And we need to let go the concept that there'll be winners and losers. The world loses, so we all lose. Now, there is a view that in some senses Alberta may profit from 2 degrees centigrade increase because the prairies may be a little bit wetter and therefore the crop yields may be better. It's not going to be like that. The future will be very tense in this world of 2 to 3 degrees centigrade change because there's going to be massive migration. There'll be food wars, there'll be water wars, there'll be tribal conflict and resource conflict. Some of you will know, and I have seen it again and again and again, that China is buying up Africa, literally. And there's a reason for that. It's a resource play for that great country. In the last 3 months, I have spent quite some time around the Sahara in my humanitarian work. And I have seen the fighting I have seen the violence, I have seen the trauma of migrating tribes. Why are they migrating? In Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso? Because there is no water. Without water, they can't grow their crops, so they move. They move to somewhere else where people already are, and there is trouble. The poorer you are, and these people are really poor, the harder you get hit. And this will not be contained within the Sahara or in other hot areas of the world. It's going to spread. And we're already seeing the evidence. The boat people in Southeast Asia, in Australasia, in the Caribbean, even now in Southern Europe. It's ugly, and it's growing every year. Not in my backyard may well become who is in my backyard. Wimby. My friends, people are going to move to survive. And as they move, there will be consequential pressure right through the world. What about the drivers of change? Well, governments generate public policy, and they do that in reaction to events and elections. Businesses innovate. They react to competition and the profit motive. And society, you and me, well, we change our consumption and behaviours in reaction to self-interest and, frankly, peer pressure. And market forces hold it all together. And there's some good examples of where that works well in environmental terms. The removal of lead in gasoline was one. And currently the drive to eliminate plastic bags in grocery stores is in another. With public policy, with technical improvement and a little in financial incentive, the dots line up and we make progress. But global warming is not so easy. We don't feel the pain and we can't find the cure. Governments are hesitant due to political risks, businesses are hesitant due to uncertain returns, and you and I have little incentive to change. Which is why I think we have to seize whatever crisis comes along in order to turn that momentum, whether it be from typhoons or droughts or natural disasters or human conflicts, into important pressure to move us all on. We've heard a lot this morning about the options that are available. But against those scenarios, we've got to make dramatic changes. And we need incentives to do that. We have for sure the ingenuity. We have the technical capacity. We have the resources to change if we have the will. And we must seize whatever we can to kick us out of our comfort zone. Now, of course, if you accept my premise that climate change will be the global priority, then the environment and business will become the same thing. Now, there are already opportunities and challenges today, but it's essentially a benign world. It's a world of carrots. Yes, people report on things, and most of that is voluntary, and it helps stimulate learning. There are attractive subsidies on offer. We have carbon markets at work, but they're essentially immature. And yes, enterprise risk management does factor in carbon futures. But if you go ask Moody's or Standard & Poor's, this is not yet the critical way in which they assess the future competitiveness of business. And companies do invest in carbon management, and we've heard some examples. But they're essentially opportunistic, and they're not coordinated. Now, we measure success, particularly in business, by operational performance and returns. And if you accept that in the future, the issue of carbon management will dominate, then for sure, tomorrow is going to look very different. Tomorrow, I'm afraid, will be about sticks. It'll be about insurance hikes. It'll be about forced choices. It'll be about regulation and penalties. There will be reputational damage to companies because, as we all know, electors as well as consumers are fickle friends. Expect aggressive legislation. Expect regulated sequestration in all its forms. Expect mandated reductions in energy demand and carbon mitigation. And expect controlling policy. And what will that deliver? Incremental? Game-changing? Yes, both. We will need both, and I think we will find both. And here's some of the big-ticket options that I'm expecting to see. And I've listed them in order of challenge. The remorseless energy efficiency improvement already exists, and I'm sure it will carry on. I think nuclear and hydrogen will have to be brought in right across the world because it offers such scale within proven technical limits. I'm expecting distributed solar PV to be a massive provider, particularly of electrical energy, as we go through the next 50 years. I expect second-generation biofuels to be mainstream. Well, some of you know I chair Iogen, and that's a second-generation biofuels company. And yes, we may be part of that. It isn't easy. We're getting there. We're going to have to get there. I expect CCS on industrial scale, a requirement. I imagine we may well see half of the world's chemical feedstocks coming from recycling or biomass. And as my complete long shot, but in terms of massive potential, we could farm energy from biomass in the oceans. All of these innovations, all of this deployment will be based on multidisciplinary integration. Engineering, chemistry, biology, medicine, physics, whatever. And for me, that's why this particular CCEMC Grand Challenge makes such sense. It can be done, but it will be tough. And the real drivers will not be logic, not be rationality, but events, calamities, which change attitudes and political agendas and election mandates and consumer choices. Time is not on our side, and we know for all change there has to be courage and commitment, and that means leadership. Leadership, powerful advocacy, taking risks in investment, channeling behaviours through consistent corrective action. And it's tough. It's tough for politicians, it's tough for businesses, and it's tough for you and I. Leadership is lonely. So where should we look for it? Not, I think, in the United Nations, or in OPEC, or in NATO, or in the G8, or the G20, in CAP, or other industry bodies. Why not? They're cumbersome. They represent divergent interests. They essentially move at the pace of the slowest. I think we will see leadership from China because of the sheer weight of numbers, the number of scientists, the number of population, and the extraordinary extremes of environmental challenge that they have to address, not least air quality. I think we may well see it from electorates with an environmental conscience, and I think particularly of Northern Europe with Germany, Netherlands and Scandinavia. But I hope in a rather more disciplined and honest way than we've seen hitherto. I will look for venture capitalists and university to lead because they have much to gain. I also think those who have much to lose will lead. Big oil, Australia and Alberta. This won't be easy. If the next big earthquake or volcanic eruption or typhoon had CO2 written all over it, that would help. The greater the pain, the stronger the pressure, the clearer the cure. But of course it won't. Now, I was born a stone's throw from where Shakespeare was born, so allow me to go back to his last play. It was called The Tempest, and it was written about 400 years ago. Now, I'm not suggesting that this in any sense was prophetic, but Trinculo in Act 2 says this, and there is a peal of thunder off stage. Alas, the storm is coming. I will hear shroud, I will hear hide, till the dregs of the storm be past. Wrong. There will be somewhere to hide, and the storm will pass. There will be nowhere to hide, and the storm will not pass. Right. There will be storms and misery, and I think there will be strange bedfellows. Our previous speaker mentioned Shell and Greenpeace. Actually, they've been talking to each other for a long time. I think they just might find themselves in a partnership. I think Canada and China could do great things together. And any other combination. Because whatever else, we're in this together. I don't present scenarios to you as a pessimist. I present them as a realist. We live here in Alberta in a remarkable jurisdiction with some of the highest quality of life anywhere in the world. We have the capacity to help lead this process. But the one thing we must hold all the way through is that this is going to be the toughest challenge the world has ever faced. It's time to get real. Thank you.
Well, that was powerful and sobering stuff, my friend.
Yeah, it was great after lunch, wasn't it? Just what we needed.
I want to start at the very, very start of the session. I mean, Tom Rand came up here and gave a compelling presentation that investment in alternative energies made tremendous sense, and ignoring some of the realities that you pointed out was folly, and encouraged energy incumbents to divert some of their cash flow to these kind of things. As someone who presided over an energy incumbent, I mean, is that A, good advice, and B, is it realistic advice?
Well, I think it's good advice, but I'm afraid I'm not persuaded by the reality. If you look at Europe, for example, which has adopted the environmental mantra to a much greater extent than North America, the scale of investment has been out of all proportion to the return. Yeah. Now, it's okay to say this is a good thing, let's subsidize it. Well, how far are you going to subsidize? Because always remember, choices have consequences. And if you're going to invest, as Germany has done, billions and billions and billions in renewable energies, that could have gone somewhere else. So I want them to go into things which really will make a difference.
Such as?
CCS, unquestionably.
Right.
Without any question. But that's going to require a technology deployment at a scale yet that we have not got our heads around.
Well, the question that I had that begged related to that is that, you know, if that is a viable alternative, that energy incumbents should be investing in these kind of new technologies, including carbon capture, you know, why is it up to the CCEMC to start a $35 million grand challenge? Why wouldn't Exxon make that kind of investment?
Exxon have made investments in carbon capture, and I know they're particularly interested in algae. Is that how you pronounce it here? Algae or algae or?
Algae, yeah.
Algae, yeah, okay. Just slight difference of language there. But yeah, I mean, they I think are interested in that, and lots of other companies have started to make those investments. The issue is going to be, though, that we need this in every industrial process in every country.
Question from Mike 2.
How do you get an energy company that calls itself an energy company, that is actually an oil and gas company, to become an energy company? And what I mean by that is there are technologies from the future that are heading our way, that are high-density, non-carbon technologies, and that they will eventually back out liquid fossil hydrocarbon fuel. And it seems to me like the time is now for us to start investing in those things, to actually bring them forward in time faster than they're coming now. But there's this tension between, well, as an energy company, as an oil and gas company, we want to get the most out of our resource. And that's a tension between that and bringing these technologies that are going to replace us eventually into closer to the present moment. How do how do you do that? How do you make that kind of a shift within an oil and gas company?
Yeah, let me rephrase this in a different way. I mean, you made it very, very clear there is no business as usual.
Yep.
Exxon said exactly the opposite, business as usual.
Well, they look at the scenario graphs that I showed, and they say hydrocarbons will remain the backbone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course they're correct. I mean, it will. So what we're going to have to do is to take policy decisions which take carbon out of that hydrocarbon profile. Now, I don't think it's realistic to expect you and I as consumers to change the debate through our behaviours right now. We are too comfortable. It's a reality. I don't think you can expect corporates, even big oil and gas companies, to channel the scale of investment needed into these massively expensive new technologies. It will have to come from public policy. And public policy will be driven by events and by electoral mandates. And that's how you're going to see a step change. I mean, Shell, and I'm sure Chevron, and I'm sure Exxon, allocate a very responsible part of their investment capital to these technologies. Let's say 5%. Maybe it's 2%, I don't know. It's nothing like enough. We should be talking about 50%.
You rather indelicately said part of the problem was we had yet to smell the horse or the copper and the smog. I mean, Europe had the most rain in 250 years. The Great Lakes never froze in the last 73 years. Australia is on fire.
Yeah.
That California is going dry. What, if not that, what is it going to have to take to change that kind of public sentiment, to say we need the strange bedfellows, we need all the kind of stuff that you're saying would be necessary to move to the next step?
Well, I think it would help if a few more of our corporate and particularly political leaders connected these dots in people's minds. The fact is, we got through the wettest winter in Europe. Maybe we bought an extra umbrella. Maybe we muttered a bit more about the weather. We got through it. You've got through a particularly difficult winter. Mm-hmm. Well, not yet, but I mean, give it another couple of months and you'll get through it. We cope because we're stoic, because we're Canadian. I mean, you know, we just keep going, don't we? But we don't see, these things don't have CO2 written all over them, and that's the problem. The whole is pretty clear.
Question from mic number 3.
Thank you very much. I think you've done a good job today of connecting some of those dots, and I appreciate your talk. A couple of times today I've heard talk about subsidies for renewable power, but I've also heard from the International Energy Agency that those subsidies are about a quarter or a fifth of the subsidies for oil and gas. Fossil fuel subsidies are somewhere over $500 billion a year. The chief economist of the International Energy Agency has called them public enemy number one. And at the G20, our own Prime Minister, along with the other leaders of the G20, promised to phase those out over the medium term. What is the medium term? I wrote 5 letters to the federal government trying to find out what's that medium term? How long is it going to be? So I wonder if you share his opinion on the danger of fossil fuel subsidies. Is it a problem? What can we do to, if you agree with that, then what can we do to scale them back?
The issue of subsidies is quite a complex question, but I understand where you're coming from. Can I just take two examples which are very real in my head? Well, one is the carbon tax issue in BC, and the other one is tax on tobacco. Tax on tobacco has been very successful in most jurisdictions in reducing cigarette smoking. I'm an ex-smoker, and it certainly helped me to see the light. Cigarettes are really incredibly expensive now in Europe. Gasoline is also a good deal more expensive than it is in North America, but it's nothing like expensive enough to make people rethink their mobility requirements, how they move, how they take their children to school, how they work, and so on. And under pressure from the electorate, the Chancellor in the UK withheld increases to taxation which had been passed by previous parliaments. I think that was a terrible mistake. We should be increasing taxation on hydrocarbons every year, remorselessly, but not just to put that into the general purse, but to direct that to the sort of technology trends that we've discussed in the CCEMC and the sort of opportunities that have been discussed in this room all day. That's the way you channel resources to start to make a difference.
Question for microphone 2.
Thank you. In your opinion, what's the responsibility for funding such capital-intensive projects as CCS falls within the hands of petroleum-producing countries and that of the countries that are using the product as well? Because, I mean, when you're dealing with technology that has international implications, but it's also dealing with international externalities, how do you quantify that externality and try to get the international community to fund it?
It's really, really difficult to get international agreement on anything. I think the whole COP discussions that have been going on now for years and years and years are just a perfect example. And I think what you have to do is always find coalitions of the willing. You have to look around and say, who's interested in this game? Saudi Arabia, I think, is beginning to work out that it has got a vested interest now in changing, because a country that hangs on one sole resource is more vulnerable than anybody. So, okay, let's do business with Saudi Arabia. I think Canada's got a huge opportunity here to be a leader in such a coalition, and there will be plenty of others who come. Some won't. I think it would be inconceivable in my mind that you would get, for example, India into one of those coalitions, although it would be great if we could. I think you just have to get a coalition of those whom you can and start to make a difference. When you do that, others will follow.
A related question. You said you weren't optimistic about Peru and that you noted one of the things that hadn't changed is our complete inability to get any kind of consensus and enforcement of international targets. And a big part of that division is the developed world versus the developing world. I mean, you've been watching this game for a long time. Is that just an immutable divide that will never be breached? Or is there a formula or some kind of compromise that could see, almost a two-tier approach to where the different countries are in terms of development right now and their commitments to greenhouse gas reductions?
Well, I've forgotten how many people turn up at these conferences, but I think it's 150 odd different countries. Number. And you're right, the economic spectrum that they represent is unbridgeable, completely unbridgeable. And so that's why the conversations just tend to go past each other. But I don't think one should just assume that the richest will always be at variance with the poorest. I think there are individual countries and individual regions which have very good reason to join in. And I think that's what will happen.
Give an example of that, just to make it a little bit more...
Well, I think the whole issue of Australasia and Southeast Asia, to me, there is a natural regional congruence of interest there. Mm-hmm. So instead of just trying to stop everybody migrating into Australia and banging them up in Papua New Guinea or wherever they go now, I think there's a real opportunity there. And Australia is really at the leading edge now of environmental vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. Microphone number 3.
First off, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. I'm interested in your perspective on corporate venture capital as a tool to spur innovation. We've heard from a number of people today and last night that the conventional fossil energy sector is probably best equipped to address many of these challenges we face. And I'm wondering how you view corporate venture capital as maybe a tool to spur a greater level of innovation and to try perhaps some new things and take some bigger risks.
By corporate venture capital, do you mean investment by corporations in venture capital type opportunities in their own right? In other words, their own funds, a small group squirreling away somewhere trying to invent new things. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean like Shell Energy Ventures, that sort of program.
I think that they are laudable, and I think history tells you that they aren't going to work.
Time for one last question.
Just to be clear, sorry. It's not that the people are not committed, it's just that essentially radical change, which is what we need, radical effective change, will come outside the current structures.
One last question for microphone 2.
Another related question regarding the role of investors. You mentioned that investors should be taking more risk. Easy to say, not as easy to do when you're responsible to your clients. I work with Alberta Investment Management Corporation, which invests many of the government funds and pension plans for the province of Alberta. So I'm just wondering if you could expand upon that. Presumably you're not just talking about venture capital, which would be a very small portion of our overall portfolio, but presumably you're talking about how we approach investing in energy, in total. So yeah, could you maybe elaborate a bit more on innovative ways to invest and how to increase risk?
Well, I entirely share your view that large pension funds and the like are subject to very clear strictures as to the level of risk that they can responsibly take. I chair a $30 billion fund, and I well understand that. I don't think you're going to see capital from those institutions making the difference. What I think you will see from pension funds is a much more rigorous scrutiny of their investments against carbon futures. And so companies that are not changing, that are not adapting and adopting, will lose value and therefore will fall outside the scope of investments. Don't expect a pension fund to be the leading edge of innovation. I don't think that's their role. No. Pension funds will be fast followers. It's the venture capitalists, it's the private investors who will be the ones who put the money up for these higher risk ventures. And the evidence of that across North America is already very, very clear. Particularly in the last few years, where returns from other asset classes have been frankly very mediocre, it's been these higher risk venture plays which have attracted the private money.